Welcome to the vulnerability session at HCII International 2021. I talk about vulnerability and why it should become a criterion in designing smart mobility and smart city concepts. My name is DrBarbaraFluegge and I'm the initiative lead of MobilityMovesMinds, a more than 2.5 years global project and study program about individual and organizational resilience. So let me share my screen. And when you look at even the first graphic out there, when we look at the image, it looks familiar, doesn't it? Because we know someone who lives on a street level. We may have encountered ourselves to a certain extent, feeling to be or being on a street level. Maybe we also know someone from our friends, from our teammates, someone who lost his or its job, right? So when we look into vulnerability, what does it mean to you? Vulnerability means, that's the official definition, to being exposed to the possibility of being attacked or harmed, physically or emotionally. Vulnerable means that we are in need. We are in need of special care, support, a protection, a measure, a help. It might be because of age, disability, a risk of abuse, or a risk of being neglected. And risk of being easily physically, emotionally, or mentally hurt, influenced, or attacked. It's actually not limited, nor it is a sign of societal class, hierarchy, belonging, or geography. It might hit you in your private environments, business, professional lives, mental lives, in your dreams. It might hit us when we actually look into our private and professional lives, our families and friends. The consequences of extreme poverty actually add to the vulnerability as such, and it reaches all parts of society. It's not only just because of COVID-19. I mean, the poverty is increasing. When we look at that 1 billion actually live in inadequate housing, in some countries, it's about 15 to 20%, 1/5 of the population facing homelessness or severe poverty. So this homelessness and severe poverty actually is not just a sign of, let's say, countries that are yet to get started with innovation and technological advancements. When you look at Germany, Baden-Württemberg, south of Germany, highly industrial region where many of the automotive companies are actually located and the suppliers there, every 5th child there is facing poverty because the parents are facing poverty because someone in the family lost a job. So vulnerability of many is actually increasing also as the wealth of a few is increasing. And of course, COVID-19 provoked this massive demand shock because we face more and more unemployment and home losses. It far exceeds the last recession. So how can we be contributing to improve everyone's quality of life and life ultimately? There is a price to pay. I call it the price of care and uncertainty. The price of care, yes, we like to pay it. We like to pay for that, for our social welfare systems. We also pay a price for uncertainty because there is still this uncertainty how to cope with vulnerability, how to actually look into that. And vulnerability is increasing. Countries pay, municipalities pay, our social systems, ultimately our organizations, we taxpayers and others are paying, and families pay. So we have a yet multidimensional element of vulnerability, and it's also caused by mobility, how mobility is still being defined. Mobility is the right of everyone. Everyone has the right to be mobile, to actually consume mobility. On the other hand, when we look into how this right is actually being pursued, there are limitations and borders and geographies that don't want us to move because there is this fear, this uncertainty, how to actually cope with that, how to cope with vulnerable groups and how to actually manage that to the best result, and not just, let's say, chasing people or refugees out of a certain country. And that's not only the multidimensional aspect of mobility and vulnerability, it's also, of course, increasing the discourse, and the discourse actually leads to, let's say, not so much implementation, because it is complex. And there's a gratitude that even increases and tops on or puts everything on top of that, and that's climate change. Because flooding incidents actually that harm us, suddenly harm, let's say, us in our normal life environment, and suddenly makes us so vulnerable. So we need to reconsider what mobility actually really means to us. When we look at smart cities, so what is the status of all these smart city approaches and great announcements? I was involved in a number of smart city reviews as well, and business cases, and how to look into business models and organizational and social business models. And of course, technology takes the lead, right? When we look at this chart here, energy, mobility, what we read here, of course, we read also healthcare, but we read a lot of technology. So, and when we look into what is out there to manage our spaces, regional spaces, rural spaces, and urban spaces, and how to turn resilience into a design principle, many of the apps out there, for example, for mobility, are still yet another ride sharing, yet another ride hailing app or service. We have hundreds of isolated apps for street workers, social welfare services, and everyone there is on the street, so is mobile. But we still have this manual business processing and paper involved. We do manual countings of homeless people on the street level. Can you imagine that we in industrialized countries actually look not into technology to cope with it, but maybe it's kind of a, let's say, there's a second stage out there. Maybe it's not just one stage, you go in a theater or you go, let's say, into your life, but there are multiple different stages. And this actually needs to be looked from one single point of view. So I call it the fatal assumption of technology first and big, fast money. So more than 120 billion actually have been invested by VC investments, for example, for mobility over a course of 2 years. And yeah, mobility, as I said, it's really about ride sharing, hailing, and so forth. And when we look at the detailed list, so the top 10 of, let's say, activities, but also functional and technical clusters, yes, we find on number 8, human-machine interface voice recognition. But the question is, are we really focusing on vulnerable groups? Are we really focusing on the people here? Or are we, let's say, more likely to prove that technology is right? And that's why in our MobilityMovesMinds project, actually our core findings are we have an utmost imbalance, and this is continuing to grow. There is financial capacity available. It could thrive change, yes, but it is captured, capsuled, isolated in technology first focused discussions. This imbalance we saw also from the cost, but also from the expectations and from the need and the social welfare systems and how they're actually being organized, that causes a massive domino effect, multiplied by pandemic effects, job loss, and living costs that are increasing. So the mobility learning curve actually, for me, paints a picture of disillusion and uninnovative mindset, because it follows the same trap. Let's just have more ride sharing offerings on the road. Let's look into autonomous driving without looking into who actually needs it and why. So the conclusion is mobility innovation and venture capitalists, they do not know how to respond yet to resolving mobility of vulnerable groups and how the impact actually is on the public general. So the social empathy, if existing, and I hope it exists, it should be and could be a key driver for diversity-driven innovation. And we need this diversity-driven innovation because then we actually can also result into and design a key competitive advantage so that we transform all these lost urban spaces into socially viable urban spaces. And we have lost urban spaces so much because everyone, let's say with the pandemic and lockdown, is not entering either spaces anymore, is moving out of urban spaces onto rural areas. And the question is, what is happening with our city centers? What is happening with the centers that are yet to be built? So what we need to look at, and this is really just a glimpse of that, is to look into what I call persona profiling, so that we really look into what the profile of personas are, the needs are, and that we start to be very specific here. We need to look into the value proposition of mobility and its imprint on society, and not vice versa, that we look into the value proposition of technology and how actually more and more money can be pumped into the pipeline of the VCs. So we need to look into what the ecosystems are made of. And each city is unique. Each rural area, there is so much uniqueness. So you have so much opportunity for your brand identity and how it actually functions together. And there's what I call the parameter of action. When you look at homeless people, the parameter is mostly up to 1 kilometer, 1,000 meters. They're not dreaming about going onto a train or an airplane. It's about how to survive in a parameter of 1,000 meters. Can you imagine what does it mean? So how can we actually improve with our innovative mindset and this technology, this parameter of action? And I call it that we need to, micro-mobility needs to be redefined. So when we look in the middle graph, it's about smart mobility. Mobility moves minds-driven concepts are diversity-driven. They look into the social distance metaphor, what it means to easily access a job, even it's far away, to achieve it, but also that it's socially viable, that we really include everyone in there. So it takes a resilience-driven point of view to drive impact-oriented mobility innovation. It's integrated mobility. So the resilience also asks technology to follow the needs and turn it in, and technology to turn into a service provider, so that we have shared platform architectures for the delivery of social services and really addressing everyone's needs from the individual personas. And that's why in Mobility Moves Minds, we have this the triad of mobility: the digital mobility, AI apps, services, autonomous driving, technology, the physical one. Think about the parameter of 1,000 meters. But to really be able to be innovative as possible and sustainable as possible, that we really scale it to everyone, we need this, what I call the mental mobility, cognitive flexibility. That's actually how the psychologists call it. So this mental mobility, this ideation, scenario building, going over the hurdle and then continuing and not having roadblocks there and then stop it. So to look into how to make mobility a livable concept for vulnerable groups. And just one glimpse on here is the Mobility Moves Minds framework. And the parts here that I highlighted, the ecosystems model is very important, that we drive diversity, so a variety, so that we are really looking into all these beautiful different dimensions and variations. We could come up with so many fantastic services and apps. The money is there in the market if we get the venture capitalists to really focus on the innovation and not just yet the next 8 years ride-sharing app. Be innovative, dear venture capitalists. Look into how to make innovation work for vulnerable groups. So if we are able to look into that, then we also are able to look into the resilience part and build resilience and ultimately result in a social business model. And I would like you to say and state, my company designs social business offerings so that vulnerable groups benefit from the growth momentum that our servitization strategy kicks off. I'd like you to say that and to state it and to look into it, what it means to your company vision and mission statement. So more than 20 individuals and companies contributed to Mobility Moves Minds. I'm very grateful about that. And yes, have a look at it. My name is Dr. Barbara Flüegge. Some call me Dr. Barbara, and I'm looking forward to discussing with you more about how mobility actually serves the vulnerable groups.